What would happen if Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, President, strategist, walked into today's America? Would he recognize the country he once led? What would he say about our divided politics, global entanglements, and fragile sense of civic duty? Today we're joined by his granddaughter, author, consultant, strategist, stateswoman in her own right, Susan Eisenhower, for a conversation not just about how Ike led, but what he might do if he were leading today. Stay with us. This is the Civic Brief.
Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Welcome to the Civic Brief, where we'll strip the jargon and dig into the real dilemmas shaping civic life, national security, and American resilience. I'm your host, Dr. Ike Wilson. Today we're asking a big question. What if President Dwight Eisenhower were alive today? What would the man who led the Allies to victory in World War II and then warned us of the military-industrial complex, what would he have to say about where America stands right now? Today our guest is Susan Eisenhower, author of How Ike Led, a stateswoman in her own right, and someone who's thought deeply about how her grandfather's principles apply to this moment of democratic backsliding, geostrategic volatility, and civic strain. From foreign policy and domestic polarization to the soul of American civicness, we'll explore what Ike's leadership can still teach us, if we're willing to listen. Susan Eisenhower, welcome to the Civic Brief, our inaugural show. And I tell you, I've been so excited about this opportunity. I've been thinking about it and anxious about it, frankly, as well, for several weeks now. I'm just going to say this straight out. I could not think of anyone better than if we could magically summon the president, your grandfather, back with us today to have this conversation, than to have you, stateswoman, statesperson in your own right, author, strategist, of course, granddaughter to the former president, to share with us your thoughts, your insights, from frankly your time as a child throughout your whole personage to this day. I thought we'd circle around our conversation around your wonderful book published in 2020, How Ike Led, the principles behind Eisenhower's biggest decisions. I thought we'd centerpiece around that, but we're not limited to that. I mean, we have so much great material from the life and times of your grandfather and your whole family, frankly. Eisenhower, as you and I have talked about, the name Eisenhower, like Washington, is a rampart for the United States. And the whole point of us having this conversation today is we live, frankly, in times where, once again, because these things are cyclical, once again, disruptive change from the local and individual, the household level, all the way to the geopolitical, the global, disruptive change is once again outpacing leaders and organizations and, frankly, citizens, outpacing our ability to, first and foremost, understand the world around us and the dynamics that are changing on an accelerated pace with disruptive technology, disruptive, hyper-polarized politics, and everything in between. Our ability to understand, and what's the point of understanding? So that we as citizens and leaders can get in front of that change and predestine, bring our own positive aims towards solving the puzzles and the problems that come with change towards more positive futures. These are cyclical times. Frankly, your grandfather, the former president, lived through one of those most recent previous cycles of great, grand, tectonic, disruptive change. You wrote the book. For our readers, I'm going to give a little bit of an excerpt on the book, just as an explainer. But you wrote the book, you published the book in 2020. I found the timing of that. When you were working on the book, obviously you could not tell at the time that by the time of its publication, the world would be going through a global pandemic. And talk about the dynamic changes that came about in terms of disruption and, frankly, the separation, figurative and literal, the separation of individual to individual, state to state, country to country, and frankly, a separateness that I believe I would offer we're still living through today in trying to get back to an e pluribus unum from many one rationale and culture and mindset. I just a quick couple of summaries on your book, and then Susan, maybe to get us started, so I'll just turn the mic finally over to you, and maybe we can begin by you giving us a quick explanation of the motivations behind why you wrote this book at the time you wrote it. But again, first for our listeners, our fellow travelers, how Ike Led, the principles behind Eisenhower's biggest decisions, you offer certainly an intimate, yet also an analytical portrait of your grandfather, not just as a military icon or two-term U.S. president, but as a master of measured leadership. The book, in my assessment, distills the principles that guided Eisenhower through crises in the nation that he led, from D-Day to desegregation, the Cold War to the Little Rock Nine. With that, I'd love to just turn it over to you for a moment, and then we'll get into a conversation. We've got 4 segments. We'll start big, and then we'll end with a reflection on where we are and where we're going forward in the future. But first, maybe explain to us a little bit about the motivation behind why you put the book together when you did, as you did.
Oh, well, first of all, it's just great to be with you and on this program. I mean, we go way back, don't we?
Yes,
all the way back
do.
to the West Point days.
It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, and that's always one of my favorite places to go, just because we have so much family history there. My father John, Ike and Mamie's only surviving child, graduated from West Point, and 2 of my maternal uncles graduated from the academy. So it's a real destination for me.
Absolutely.
You're absolutely right. We are living in a period of extremely disruptive activity. It's all because of I think disruptive technology plays a very big role, but few people have really given it much thought that a period very similar to that occurred after World War II. Right. After the atomic bomb, of course, we moved into the hydrogen bomb era, which had so much greater capacity for destruction. And all of these things needed rules of the road. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of social dislocation after World War II. Europe was a mess. The Far East was a mess. Actually, the United States was the only nation still standing, in effect. And so Eisenhower leaves his stint as the first Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, had a hiatus as Chief of Staff of the Army and then President of Columbia University. And
a hiatus as Chief of Staff.
Well, I don't know. Oh, goodness. I hope the Army will forgive me for that.
No, it's wonderful. It's amazing. It's just talks about the...
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting. And then he was the first commander of NATO forces.
Right.
So all of those changes, many of them that were stood up for the first time, fascinated me, of course. Then you combine that with the rapid technological change, including the beginning of real computers and
yes.
All of the impact that had on science and technology and everything else. And then we had space was opened as a new arena for not only the potential to connect us all, but the potential to destroy us all if it wasn't figured out properly. So he comes to office at this very dramatic time. So in 2020, when the book came out, I had been working on it for about 2 years, and then we have a pandemic, and I thought, rats, because if I'd known we were going to have a pandemic, I would have added another chapter. Because during World War I, Dwight Eisenhower was responsible for the first tank unit in the United States military. Mm-hmm. And during that time, he had to manage a very, very serious outbreak at this tank facility, yes. Camp Holt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And nobody gave him any instructions on how to organize this. And his leadership at that time became the best practices for the U.S. Army in pandemic management, including everything, from wearing masks to isolation. But this, had not been properly thought through before these things happen.
Amazing.
I would have added that chapter, but the similarities are very eerie between the life and times of his career and what's going on here. So, in a nutshell, let me just say that I wrote the book when I did because, first of all, it was the 75th anniversary at that time of, the end of World War II. And I'm at Normandy. I guess I can't do my math fast enough, but it was a big.
This is the reason why we're social scientists.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that was a very big World War II event that was directly connected with him. And then we had the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated in 2020. And then we had an election that was underway. And all of these things sort of led back to Ike. I just figured that he still had something to say to us today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And by the way, if I may add,
yes,
not
please.
only had something to say to us, but I also thought that the American people ought to know what that was and know why they were honoring him on the Mall, because he is in the last spot in the monumental core of Washington,
Yes.
along with George Washington, his other military compatriot, and Ulysses S. Grant, who
Yes.
also was, the major military figure from the Civil War.
Absolutely. Susan, I love speaking with you because every time I do, I learn something new. I did not put together your grandfather's early years as a military man in his not only his involvement, but his keystone activity during World War I in dealing with the great influenza. And so the parallel between then and now, still with coming out of the post COVID-19 pandemic, another lesson learned. I'm a big believer in, I talk a lot about compound wicked problems, complexity, complicatedness, and compound security dilemmas. And we're living in, again, one of those moments of great compounding befuddlement. I think what adds to that, multiplies that befuddlement, if you will, is the ahistoricism that sometimes comes with American exceptionalism,
Right.
Our lack of knowledge and revisit to history. And an outcome of that oftentimes is an amplification of the ambiguity and of the crisis of self, within ourselves, and external to ourselves. We add drama to an already complicated, complex, wicked problem reality because everything looks new to us, and some of those new things aren't all that new. And I'm a big believer in reviewing histories because, again, as I said in my preamble, we're in another cycle. These things are cyclical. What you've just taught us and shared with us again is, there's a lot to harvest from the great influenza, but also from the leadership challenges in those activities that, in terms of leading through those kinds of dramatic transitions, that frankly could have helped us in 2020 and certainly can help us today. Again, our big question, we always like in the Civic Brief to lead off with a big question, and typically a question that we've harvested from readership, from my Substack, Compound Security Unlocked, and other arenas. Again, for all of us, what would happen if Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, President, Strategist, walked into today's America, right? You've already got us off to a great start with this.
Well, I'll answer that in just a minute, but I'd like to add one more important thing to this Camp Colt period. First of all, he was 27 years old, and when he was 28 years old, he received a Distinguished Service Medal for the combination of training, the new tank corps,
Right.
And also managing the pandemic. Now, what's really noteworthy here, and I hope that your listeners have an opportunity to really absorb this. He was told by all of his contemporaries that he was in a dead-end job and that he ought to be at the front. fighting. And then after they came home and started hobnobbing with the other generals, Ike was sent to write a book called The American Battlefields of France. So he was over there chronicling what his fellow cadets were doing while he was fighting the pandemic and trying to train the tank corps in Gettysburg. And then they thought that was a dead-end job. But World War II comes around, and there's nobody who knows more about tanks and tank training than Dwight Eisenhower. And he knows the terrain of France like the back of his hand because he wrote a book about every crossroads in rural France, which came in extremely handy. And the other thing is that he didn't fall into the trap, and this is to the next point you're going to say. He didn't fall into the trap of getting to World War II and his set of responsibilities and be fighting the last war.
Yes.
So he got criticized a lot because he hadn't been in combat. But the thing is that World War I was a war of, you might say, stability as opposed to mobility.
Yes.
And World War II, as I said, it was about mobility.
Yep.
It would have been very easy to fall back into a comfort zone there. And so I've found that sort of an inspiring myself.
Absolutely.
Set of ways to think about things because you have to be projecting towards the future. Now, back to your point about what would he say today? If he were Rip Van Winkle, he might wake up and find out, OMG, is this the same place I left? But if he had been alive the whole time,
right.
I don't think it would have come to this because he was an influential figure even after his presidency.
Yes.
And he was a kind of ballast for people. He was a symbol of stability and good judgment, and was not afraid to speak out about things that were clearly divisive. There's a wonderful quote I found from my book in which he says that the deep divisions in our country are a welcome sight to a dedicated enemy. And I think he would look at what's going on in this country right now as the national security issue, which it truly is. In other words, he worked during his administration to bring the country together. And I think it's rather remarkable that he averaged a 68% approval rating in 8 years and got 80% of his legislative agenda through a Democrat-held House and Senate.
I think that's, I may be wrong. I think that's unprecedented still to this day, historically, empirically. Quite amazing. Susan, you've led us right into, we're well into segment one. We want to talk about the academic in me has to use these big words, right? Eisenhowerian leadership in uncertain times, right? We're well into that. Let me just ask you this pointed question. In the book, How Ike Led, you write about your grandfather's belief in restraint as well as in moral authority, and where you've brought us right to this leading edge here. How did that shape his decision-making during his moments of crisis?
Well, about the moral authority, he wasn't suggesting, let me just put that in context. He had what he called the Great Equation.
Yes.
And the Great Equation was how he defined national security. He defined national security as our military capability and our potential to deter our adversaries with respect to our own physical security. He believed that a healthy, prosperous economy was a second leg of this stool, and that the nation's moral authority in the world was the other strong leg of this. So if you evaluate those three things, we're in a bit of trouble right now. I mean, again, back into the remarkable thing, I thought as I wrote this book, not as a granddaughter, but as an analyst,
right,
is that he managed in the midst of building the interstate highway system and the St. Lawrence Seaway and all of the tremendous, he started the FAA and organizing, air and ground infrastructure for modern America. But he did that by also balancing the budget 3 times in 8 years and coming very close on another 2, and left his a successor with a budget surplus. This was not magic accounting. This was hard stuff. And
I'm
he
so
got.
glad you just said it's not magic accounting, because what immediately came to my mind, Susan, when you laid this out was most people today, if not everyone, would say this is the stuff of an oracle. This is magic. This is magic time. I mean, most people today would say this can't be done, but you just
Well,
dissuaded us of that.
and by the way, may I tell you that he also expanded Social Security significantly
Right.
and the social safety net. But how did he do this? He taxed the rich.
Right.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there were plenty of people in my childhood who came in and out, some of whom were wealthy. And I remember being on the sun porch once when one of them said, hey, Mr. President, when are we going to cut taxes? And he did not like that. And he said, how do you think we're going to pay for things? Okay,
Right.
That was the end of that subject.
Right. Well, we as Americans, we know, at least from a bumper sticker standpoint, this idea, our birth, credo, no taxation without equal representation. We don't spend enough time, in my not so humble opinion, on the reverse of that equation. Can we have representation, true, small d democratic, small r republic representation, without some form of us being taxed, meaning engage in the civicness of our country? The reverse of that, no taxation without representation, is as important, if not arguably more important. We're talking about taxes in a dollars and cents standpoint, but a broader understanding of what it means to be taxed as a citizen of a democratic republic. Right?
Well, let me just go back to how the rich were taxed. They had options, okay? So the highest rate was 90%, if you can get over that.
Oh, yeah.
But nobody paid 90%. You know why? Because the only alternative to paying the highest rate was to give it to charity. Okay, and some of the biggest foundations were created during that period of that high taxation period. Because the thing is that people who had done well, and believe me, even having what was left over after 90%, the amount of wealth that had been created, I have to say, by the industrial sector of our country during World War II was significant. But those were the days when people made charitable deductions to manage their tax obligations, but everybody was the winner because they went into charitable organizations. That wasn't just it was philanthropy, a mutually beneficial type of philanthropy. Today, a lot of people, and I don't say this in a thoroughly negative way, I say it as an analyst again, use philanthropy as a way to gain influence and also to control, rather than the federal government, the shape of society. It was a little different in those days. A lot of this went into flat out charity. And education and other things. But still, there was much more of a wall between the philanthropy and getting your way with the receivers of that money.
Right. And without that quid pro quo, with the absence of that, it still remains a service to nation, into the world, a service, a public service that does not become a privatized. I mean, I like to consider myself a lifelong public servant. Part of being a public servant is bringing that quiet professionalism. You serve, you don't, and there should be no expectation for any type of accolade. I even get uncomfortable with the thank you for your service kind of thing. It seems today, and I'm speaking very generally, I don't want to be overly indicting of all of us, but it does seem that we've lost a little bit of something when, at least even subconsciously, there seems to be some kind of expectation of acknowledgement, of recognition, some type of, even the smallest quid pro quo. What you're talking about is not that. You're talking about something completely different. In the long history of American political development, I would mark on my whiteboard, what you've just talked us through as one of a short list of critical things that we've lost in our ahistoricism that we need to bring back into our entrepreneurialness and our entrepreneurial spirit as Americans today.
Well, I would add one other point, and I think it gets lost sometimes, but we're only talking about a certain number of years after World War II.
Right.
And actually, it was Eisenhower and the Eisenhower administration that ended the war in Korea.
Right.
And so this is in July of 1953. Just in his first term, he promised to go to Korea and to sort this out. I think he had, it wasn't difficult to take him seriously because he wasn't that long from the war itself, and he
Right.
accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and Europe. So this guy meant business.
You tend to take someone like that seriously, yes.
Yeah, but the point is that the whole nation was involved in that war effort.
Right.
And even though a smaller number, still that sense of a larger engagement here globally was underway. And if it wasn't politically unifying necessarily, there was a unity of national psychology, which
beautiful.
is that there is something bigger than ourselves here.
Beautiful. Yes.
And this is why we have to resolve our differences.
Yes.
Because we can never have that happen again.
Yes.
And when I tell my undergraduate students at Gettysburg College that 65 million people lost their lives in World War II, they can't get their heads around it.
No way.
They can't get their heads. The destruction was so overwhelming, and everybody, was expecting to either lose their own lives or the lives of people they loved and cared so much about. And there was a sense of shared sacrifice.
Right.
We don't have today.
No, you mentioned the 65 million. What immediately pops in my mind is with sadness, the shock that we had our difficulties coming into communing with one another with here in the United States, a million deaths from the pandemic.
Yeah.
Estimates of between 7 to 9 million worldwide. And it was fractious. It was fractious, not unifying. And
Right.
we're still trying to find that pathway back to an e pluribus unum. We don't have the sense of scale and depth of service to something higher and beyond self. What you're speaking to much more eloquently than I said a few minutes ago, Susan, is that reverse of no taxation without representation. But there can be no unified service beyond self representation without some form of that citizenry being taxed. Yes, in dollars and cents, but also in a broader sense of taxation, engagement, being pulled to engagement. That's what we're trying to get after in terms of the Civic Brief. I want to pivot a little bit and dive a little more deeply in, for a couple of minutes a few minutes on foreign policy and global strategy. Let's just preamble us into this a little bit. I'd say that foreign policy isn't just about force. Your grandfather was all about that. I'm looking forward to hearing your insights on that. It's about foresight. You've already given us a lot on that. Few leaders understood that better than your grandfather, President Eisenhower. He didn't just build military alliances, he built moral ones. He built moral alliances. And as we wrestle with what I call gray zone rivalries, teetering alliances, and new frontiers of tech power, I think it's worth asking, what would I have a hard time even saying Ike, call him an Ike, because this is the one time when I'm talking to you about your grandfather when I'm comfortable with my own nickname. But what would Ike make of today's fractured global order? And in this segment, a couple of questions regarding his grand strategy. Rooted in prudence, I would say, not provocation. Might this still hold valuable insights today? Susan, let's kind of step into that, and I'll let you speak broadly about how would he think and approach, this fractured global order that we're dealing with today?
Well, first of all, again, this is Susan the analyst rather than the family member, though in my book I do make cameo appearances. And I thought I could add something to the way he thought about the process he went through in thinking about things, because I was often on the receiving end of his methodology, you might say. It was called the dinner table conversation that my brother and I managed to ruin by arguing across the table about public and foreign policy. I remember at the age of 11 arguing for a larger budget for NASA. I mean, that's how bad I was as a kid. I'm just saying that, I love this stuff.
Yes, yes.
And so what was very clear to me is that he had, and even more so now that I've read his diaries and everything, he had what we call EQ, He came from a family of 7 boys, if you can imagine that. 6 surviving boys, big, outsized personality boys.
I remember
And
the stories of the roughhousing.
oh my,
That's
the
one
rough
of
house.
my
Oh
gosh.
my God. Oh yeah. Well, but the thing is, he was the middle child, and it was his job, as it is a little bit in my own family's. I'm a middle child too. And he was very often found himself resolving the differences.
So we should not be surprised of the middle way coming from being the middle child, might you say?
Exactly. I'd
Oh my
say.
goodness.
I'd
Oh my
say. Yeah, yeah,
goodness.
yeah. Well, I'm a middle way person too.
Yes.
I'm the radical moderate,
Yes.
the one that likes to prove that actually moderation is a way of looking at things.
Absolutely.
But in any case, he'd say, "Oh, hold on. Now, I want to hear you describe for me how that looks to the other guy." And it was a great set of lessons to go through that, and a few other things. Never corner anybody. That was another one that he, because you want to have the flexibility in the cornering part. You don't want to corner people, because then there's no way out, even if the other side wants to do the right thing.
Yes.
When you look at it from somebody else's perspective, I think sometimes it's called strategic empathy, but I really don't like that phrase, because it sounds like you're only being sympathetic when you're doing that analysis.
Right.
You have to do that analysis, whether it's Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, or you have to do that evaluation, because if you don't, you have no hope of even the first couple of steps towards understanding what they might do next.
Yes.
And the whole philosophy around the D-Day invasion site was all based, I shouldn't say all, but a big part of it was based on their analysis of the preconceived ideas that Nazi Germany had about us.
Yes.
So we don't have this today, and therefore, if it's all about us, and we can't even do a remote evaluation of why this looks different to you,
Right.
and why we should care, and why we're going to dig our heels in, that's not the way forward. So I think I'm very, very interested in that. I analyzed, for the Washington Post and the LA Times, and I was on many government committees at the end of the Cold War. And I think I don't want to pat myself on the back here, but I thought the place was going to collapse long before anybody else did.
Right.
Just because I was over there traveling around the former Soviet Union, and I kept saying to myself, if I were in their position,
Yes.
this is not sustainable.
Well, it's very Kennan-esque. I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is George Kennan.
Right.
Yeah, I know Kennan had, right. I know he had a series of great roles to play under Eisenhower's administration, particularly with Project Solarium and whatnot. But that's what really comes to my mind. And also, this idea of what I might call a strategic psychology, a strategic psychological analysis of the other. I won't even say enemy, but I would say the other, right?
Well, he also had the benefit of actually working with the Soviet Union during World War II. You see, a lot of people, the polling figures are really quite alarming, but I think it's maybe a bit over a majority of Americans who thought we fought the Soviet Union during World War II, or they were on the Nazi side. No, actually, the Soviet Union was an indispensable ally of the Western Alliance. And so he had a pretty good, even a gut sense of how strategically they organized themselves, how they thought about the use of manpower, how they thought about saving lives. And believe it or not, some of the things they did that we would never accept in our own military was actually designed to save lives by the number, as opposed by the individual.
Yes.
He understood that, and I think during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy asked him, was this going to be the end of the world? I don't know exactly what Eisenhower's response was, but my father, John, once told me that the conclusion of the intelligence community or the administration or whatever during the Cold War was, you're going to love this. He said their assessment was they are not early Christian martyrs. In other words, they're not going to voluntarily commit suicide,
That's right.
So we've got some leeway here.
We've got a little wiggle room here, yeah.
If we can I would also say, you ask what he would do or say, what's different about his principles. He believed talking, talking. And I personally have been, upset that we have not tried the talking route in a more aggressive way, because certainly the position between Russia and Ukraine is extremely complicated, and it goes way back in history. It even goes way back, or more recently, to World War II.
Yes.
And if we could talk more, we would have a greater capacity to find that common ground. You can't just say, you got to stop this. I mean,
Exactly.
because nobody, after all of this death and destruction, is going to do that and keep their own sense of self-worth. And every nation demands that.
Yes.
It's a recognition and appreciation of their own self-worth. So anyway, I learned a lot from him. Also about, you mentioned the word restraint. It's one of my favorite words when I think of Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah.
May I add another one to this?
Of course.
All right. Reflection. There's a wild idea. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Everybody hold still for a second. Reflection. Wow. Do you know what that means? That means not making a decision based on the last person who talked to you. It means asking for study of certain issues. He learned from the war that most of those issues were not, that there wasn't adequate intelligence. So he'd have to take some risk. A lot of risk at times.
Yes.
But as he described, he said that the decisions during his presidency were every bit as great and as burdensome, you might say. But at least there was time to study them, and to trust your government to study them in the right way, which is based on facts, based on the intelligence input they had and things. But I think that this idea of reflection, then he had hobbies.
Yes.
I want you to know that he's just been called the cookingest president of the United States. He was a great cook, and he had culinary opinions. He did.
Wow.
He had the kitchen installed on the third floor of the White House so he could go upstairs and rustle up a meal,
Amazing.
I know. It's pretty funny. And I've got a great picture of him with his outdoor barbecue just outside the pillars of the White House. Yeah, no. He
I'd love to see that picture.
But having hobbies and allowing your brain time to work is something we're also missing today, because we don't put our phones down, and we think that making noise and failure to prioritize is what I sort of sum it up as. And
well, we're gonna take a quick diversion here a little bit. We're still talking about foreign policy and global strategy, but on this point, I'm reflecting on Churchill, his fine art pastime, Art as Pastime, the great little book that I use in my classes all the time. Your grandfather, an artist, a fine artist in his own right, and really in that Churchillian kind of tradition. Maybe Churchill mimicked Eisenhower in this regard, but the use and utility of that art as a pastime, if you will, played in giving his mind, body, and spirit a relief at those heady moments. It gets to the 2 R's you talked about. It seemed to be part of the recipe of restraint and reflection. Maybe a couple of words on that, Susan.
Yeah, well, I guess if we're going to be in threes, we could also say resilience. And
there you go.
And so the reason I'd add resilience to that is that's what having a hobby can do, because it can allow the brain to take in other factors, including how well you're holding up.
Right.
No, it was actually Churchill who was a painter before Eisenhower, though I would encourage everybody to look at Dwight Eisenhower's painting of Winston Churchill. It's magnificent.
Awesome.
But anyway, the whole purpose of that painting was to, all right, now think about this. From the Oval Office, he once said to his secretary, look out that window, he says, how many shades of green do you see? Now, this is a brilliant metaphor for, you see that issue out there?
Right.
How many shades of nuance do we have involved in this? So actually, his White House staff said that if he had a really big decision to make, And he had been listening to, his cabinet, who were expected to be up to date on all of these issues, even if it didn't relate to their department.
Beautiful.
And he had to go up and make a decision, and he never made it in a noisy room, ever. He would go up for 15 minutes, maybe sometimes a half an hour, and paint, and did not like to be interrupted. And so that makes some sense in a larger. It's really strategy management. It's actually allowing your brain to take in everything everybody said. And then he had a kind of mental methodology about how to prioritize what he and his staff called the long pole in the tent,
Yes.
which is the one that's going to keep the tent up. And if it falls over, the whole thing collapses.
That's right. That's right. Oh, yes. Yep. That comes right from the military experience.
There we are.
No,
this is what I learned from this is that, and I want everyone to just remember this, is that he's not a typical politician who ought to be evaluated with all of the people who had devoted their lives to, politics and public policy. He was a general, like Washington, and better to be evaluated among the military leaders who then had two term presidencies. But I think it is an interesting thing to note that difference, because the key is that Eisenhower, the general, is the same person who is Eisenhower, the president, except for one thing. He never wanted to see a war like that again.
Yes.
And he understood that the weapons now available to our society and the Soviet Union and a few other countries as well could be so much more catastrophic than World War II, that this had to be an active effort to seek peace.
Perfect segue into, I want to ask another question in this same genre of foreign policy, global strategy, but this is going to transition into as we begin to end with some conversations on civic virtue. But here's the question, and you've riffed us right into this, Susan. His military industrial complex warning, right? It's now prophetic. Right, we're living it. We've added to it. It's an enlarged context. We have to think about this now in terms of tech power and artificial generative intelligence more pointedly. But let's look at today. It's not just military hardware. Again, it's tech, it's surveillance, it's even AI. Right. How might I respond to the rise of what some call the military industrial scientific technological complex? Again, that expanded context.
Yeah, well, of course, in his farewell address, he talked about the scientific technological elite.
Exactly.
Boy, nobody's focused on that enough, because I think that is extremely prescient. Yes. In any case, I think the military industrial complex piece of the farewell address comes out of his experience with accusations by the other party that we had a missile gap and we had a bomber gap, actually in proper order, a bomber gap and a missile gap. And it was pure politics, because they were challenging the president about things that were classified information that they knew he couldn't respond to publicly.
Right.
So they got a lot of cheap shots out of that. And he realized that in this restructuring of the military that was underway, a lot of people who were not prohibited by law from doing it, but shouldn't have been doing it, were up on Capitol Hill lobbying directly for their own interests. And these were even some of his former comrades from World War II.
Right.
And then he understood, my goodness, we're going to have a standing military because of the Cold War. So the public needs to be warned that the only thing that can mitigate this extraordinary new power that had come to play was an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. So I would say today, if Ike were here, if he woke up out of a deep sleep,
yes,
he would look around and he'd say, we have to really up our civic knowledge, our civic dialogue. We have to re-energize people around feeling like their vote and their commitment to this country makes a difference, person by person.
Yes. Oh, perfect. That's going to take us into some conversation on civic virtue, and then we're going to do some reflection. I want to get a reflection on where we are. We're in as a nation, we're in our 250th cycle around the sun. We'll celebrate the birthday next year, July.
Right.
But we're already in that 250-year cycle, right? We're already 250 years old. We'll celebrate later. And I want to do some, take advantage of the opportunity I have with you here, Susan, to reflect on that. But first, let me just give a quick preamble to talk about this civic virtue piece. We've talked about this already today. We live in a moment that seems to reward the loudest in the room. But your grandfather, President Eisenhower, proved that real leadership doesn't need to shout. Behind the scenes, he used what historians call the hidden hand, a style that emphasized quiet influence, that reflection, that resolve, that resiliency, not public grandstanding, quite the contrary. And so in a couple of questions here, I'd like us to explore what it means to lead with dignity, to protect institutions, to govern not for spectacle, right, but for the long haul. And let me just start with a more pointed question here. And this idea of the hidden hand leadership has been called both brilliant and also misunderstood. I think in many respects, if we're not being Pollyannish about it, during his own time, there were skeptics in terms of the reflectiveness and the restraint, the strategic patience, and it being misunderstood and misconstrued. Today, in an era where performative leadership is the norm, would Ike's quiet style even survive, let alone succeed today?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say, yes, he was a strategist and he wanted to get stuff done. And if you look at what that administration did, it's pretty remarkable.
Amazing.
But in order to get things done, you can't be, as my father John used to laughingly say, the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. You've got to give other people, you have to empower other people to be making points. You have to be accepting the responsibility when something goes wrong. So I'd like to say that a hidden hand approach is one of many tools in that man's strategic toolbox.
Right.
But it's not inconsistent with transparency. You could be completely transparent. He accepted responsibility for whether or not the D-Day invasion failed or not, including took responsibility for the weather forecast.
You bet.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's not that he was unwilling to accept responsibility or be transparent. It was just a different way of mobilizing people and being able to figure out how to use a kind of good cop, bad cop. And I don't mean it in quite such harsh terms, but to have everybody play a different role in the drama that would lead to a certain result. Now,
maybe point, counterpoint, and then again, a cabinet-led approach to leadership.
Yes. And so you have to look at how he managed this fractious alliance during World War II,
right.
To understand that he was not going to fight every battle. The ones he was going to fight, he was going to try and treat everyone with dignity and transparency about his position. But sometimes, it might take some kind of different approach that would make it possible for everyone to come out of it with the results they needed. And if any of your listeners read How Ike Led, please read the chapter on Joseph McCarthy.
Oh my gosh.
It is a brilliant dissertation on his approach. It doesn't mean everybody would have to accept his approach, but his approach was that his analysis was that the only thing Joseph McCarthy wanted was attention. Right. And wanted someday to be president of the United States. And he was not going to drag the presidency down into this squabble and manage for the year and a half or so that he was dealing with the McCarthy problem, never to mention this man's name in public once.
Right.
Because his attitude was, all the guy wants is publicity, and I'm not going to give it to him. And everybody was on his case about this, but he was working behind the scenes to get in place the people who had the power in the Senate of the United States to censure Senator McCarthy. The presidency did not have that power. So he focused on the goal and made sure that he did not empower McCarthy in any way. But one other thing he said, well, listen, if I get into a fight with Senator McCarthy, this is going to make people come to his support. And I don't want him to have that support. So I'm not going to take him on publicly. What he did is he'd stand up and talk about American values. Get this. Don't join the book burners. he said, at Dartmouth
Right.
University in the middle of this crisis.
Well, get back to fundamentals. Get back to fundamentals. This reminds me of another identity of your grandfather, which, a lot of people don't talk about. Maybe a lot of Americans don't know. Even we today, so far, haven't mentioned expressly. But yes, he was president of the United States, but he was also president of Columbia University.
Yeah.
He was a university president, and as I understand it, frankly, from your wonderful book, Susan, he was the intellectual life and the learned in the read life, the studied life was always about him just as much as roughhousing with the brothers, right? From an early age, he was a reader, he was a studier, self-studier, and this was always a part of his personage. Maybe a couple of thoughts on a reflection or two. Eisenhower, Ike the scholar, Ike the academic, and maybe how this weaves into his way as well.
Well, I must say that his bookshelf is very revealing, and I would divide it into two categories: his bookshelf, where he actually read the serious books, which he did, and then his nightstand, because on his nightstand he had a bunch of Western novels, and there was a lot of ha-haing about how lowbrow the president's reading list was. They misunderstood the difference between trying to get asleep at night versus educating yourself for a job. So he was extraordinarily well read when it came to military strategy and history. Mm-hmm. And there's a wonderful scene in that book where he is invited to the history department's annual dinner, and they couldn't stand it any longer. And they said to University President Eisenhower, "Why didn't you invade the Balkans? Churchill wanted to go through the Balkans to defeat Nazi Germany." And he gave a 500-year history of the Balkans and a intimate description about the topography in that part of the world, and then challenged them to tell him how he was going to get tanks over the mountains and this and that and the other thing. Right. And so they all sort of went, "Oh, okay." He's not just a general, because I think at Columbia, like a lot of academic institutions, they don't understand the military culture, and then are always a little bit dubious, perhaps, if that's a fair word. Is that okay?
You're being incredibly fair. Yes.
Okay.
Fairer than I would be, coming from that community as well. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderfully diplomatic. Yes. And
so he was very well read, and he.
Well, it seemed to me to be a bridge. Again, we're talking about a man and a statesman who lived at the centerpiece, at the nexus of all these other real things that we tend to isolate and separate and institutionalize in brick and mortar as separateness. The separateness of academia from defense security, from the doing enterprises. We've separated a Department of Defense, which some are arguing it may go back to even those earlier times of calling it a Department of War.
Oh, I hope not.
I hope not too, but word has it that's the trend line. But that being bad enough, perhaps, but being separated from the State Department, which arguably would be not only the diplomatic side of the house, but the peace objective of why you might need to have a Department of Defense or War in the first place, purposing the latter for purposing the former, or the former purposing the latter. And then, look at what we've done in terms of the decimation. We're not going to get into the political partisan aspects of this, certainly not in this venue. But what we've done with the development community, right? Particularly on the governmental side, with USAID. We've, if we think about this from a defense, diplomacy, and development triad, right? An iron triangle, if you will, of those three. Your grandfather lived and practiced at the middle, at the centerpiece of that. As from my perspective, an equilateral triangle is very stable, but when you weaken any one of those legs, you're left with something completely unstable, and it leads to ambiguity. We've weakened we've separated two of the legs, the defense and diplomacy, and we've all but eliminated the third in terms of development. And then we look around the world today, with the compound conflicts and wars and competitions ranging from Gaza to the South China Sea and everything in between. Um, we should not be surprised with how we've perplexed ourselves. I'll pause there, see if you have any
No,
reactions to that.
I mean, I think extremely well said. So I would just say one thing for those listening or watching
Yeah.
this program that they may not realize that, first of all, I think Ike wouldn't like the term in the military warrior. I think in those
Thank you for
days it was
saying
called
that.
serviceman
Oh,
because they were
yes.
serving their countries.
Oh,
The
yes.
other thing I would say is that people don't recognize that the foundations of our soft power, of course, the Truman administration played a big role in that with the Marshall Plan.
Hmm.
But then if you look at Voice of America, Good Ship Hope, and a lot of Alliance for Progress, it later became known as the Peace Corps, but Alliance for
Right.
Progress was its predecessor. It starts in the
Sure
Eisenhower
was.
administration. A
Yes.
very, very big emphasis on soft power. So what does that mean? That means it's another piece of a strategy. And he deeply believed
Hmm.
that authoritarian regimes want to keep their populations in the dark about the rivalry and what this alternative was and is. And the soft power was critical for helping people think internally in different ways. I had the opportunity on one of my first trips to the Soviet Union to be there with the great legendary jazz saxophonist Grover Washington Jr.
Oh,
And
wow.
people
Wow.
were coming out of, everybody wanted to meet him. How did they know about Grover Washington Jr.? Because they heard him on Voice of America.
There you go.
And you know that jazz in the Soviet Union is directly related to all those soft power programs. And they
Wow.
loved America because they produced greats like Grover and all of those other wonderful soft jazz performers and that sort
Amazing.
of thing. So we really, today we're dismantling a lot of that in the name of money, but relatively speaking,
Right.
it's a very, very small part of the budget. But he believed, and he said once, that as soon as the people who live in under repressive regimes, as soon as they know as much about us as they can, they will understand that we are not a threat. You
Again,
know,
back to the strategic
and
psychology of all
someday
of
he
this.
said this is going to require full reform in the Soviet Union, or it's going to bring about the collapse, and we know what happened.
Well, and I love how you just I love that statement there, Susan, because I'm just going to reveal my cards here. I'm a terrible poker player because I do not have a poker face, and I love to show my competitors my cards. I'm going to show my competitors my cards, not trying to box you in, but when you're talking about your grandfather foresighting this, and you lived it. You lived it as an analyst, as a strategist through those heady ending days of the Cold War in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So you just can't pass up the juxtaposition between your grandfather and yourself at bookends of this grand tectonically shifting and redefining transition moment. And I'm hopeful that I'll be able to bring you back, not just one more time, but maybe on regular occasion. I'd love to talk to you about this piece and one of your other wonderful books, Breaking Free, that you talked about. But
Thank you. Well, it was a remarkable thing. My grandfather, presided over very, very dangerous times during the Cold War. I think we were lucky to have him. But I had
absolutely.
just sort of to close that out, because please do invite me back.
Yes.
I just want to say it was really an extraordinary privilege for me to be part of our efforts at reconciliation
Yes.
with the Soviet Union. I did so much work for the Department of Energy in their
Yes.
cooperative threat reduction programs, along with DOD. And I served on a committee at the National Academy that was a back channel to be working on arms control issues with Russian scientists and the International Space Station. And what a privilege in a lifetime to see that go from Khrushchev's Berlin ultimatum to being privileged on behalf of the Department of Energy to visit Russia's #1 top secret nuclear weapons facility.
Incredible. I mean, dare I say, it takes an Eisenhower to help the nation get through these major transformative moments. And one of the reasons why I'm so intent on bringing you in, Susan, and frankly summoning the spirit and the principles of leadership of your grandfather, our great President Eisenhower. But I want to talk a little bit about the Republic, the Republic at 250. Again, we're in our 250th cycle around the sun now. We'll celebrate next year. But as we approach the celebration of America's 250th year, gosh, we're faced with a critical question, at least one. Are we living up to the ideals we inherited? Eisenhower warned us about the forces that could erode democracy from the inside, things like complacency, disengagement, even well-meaning overreach. In this final moment here with you today, Susan, it's a moment to zoom out. What did Ike expect of citizens, of leaders, of future generations? And Susan, if your grandfather were here today, what do you think he'd ask of us? Not as Republicans or Democrats, but as stewards of the Republic.
Well, I think he would challenge us to be more knowledgeable about history, not just global history, but our own national history.
Yeah.
And I think, he would say, don't be frightened.
Oh, wonderful.
If we come together and work together, whatever the dangers are in the future can be mitigated by joint action. There is a point during the Cold War, he just said, we're sort of losing so much energy because everyone's so fearful. And, that creates an immobility. And so I think what he'd want to do is to inspire us to move forward. Of course, we're going to have problems and we're going to have dangers and the rest of it. But my take on America today, I have lost no optimism about the future, but what I do want is for everyone to understand that they play a critical role. And the thing is that pessimism and fear take energy that you could be using for a positive cause.
Absolutely.
And so maybe I could end on this note. He used to tell us kids, be for something. Be for something. Don't be against something. Be for something. I think that's how I'd like to leave it.
Susan, no better way to leave it. And again, thank you so much for all you do, all you've done for your life of service to nation and the world, in a life that continues of service beyond self.
And the same to you, my friend Ike.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to a running dialogue. And thank you so much for helping us launch the Civic Brief. And we're going to endeavor to live up to the rampart that is Eisenhower through these conversations. Thanks again so much. And look forward to you next time. Thank you. Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
Travelers, you've just heard Susan Eisenhower reflect on her grandfather's principles. Now let's bring that wisdom forward into the lens of compound security. President Eisenhower believed in balance between might and morality, strength and restraint, liberty and duty. Now these weren't just Cold War values, they're survival values in a world like ours. Because today we don't face one crisis at a time. We live in a compound era. Climate disruption, strategic rivalry, civic erosion, all happening at once. And Ike wouldn't tell us to panic, posture, or point fingers. He'd tell us to think deeper, plan smarter, and lead with steadiness. Leadership, he'd say, is not about showmanship. It's about service. Now, let's talk about July 2025, Central Texas floods, lives lost, entire communities underwater, power knocked out, roads impassable, and a government caught flat-footed. The storm itself, natural. The disaster, entirely man-made. It's what happens when leaders operate in silos, when they react too late and ignore the warning lights, blinking across every system from infrastructure to trust. But here's the thing. It didn't have to be this way. Let me pause here and explain something. The wise way isn't just a framework. It's a strategic methodology I developed over decades in national security, diplomacy, and leadership education. It stands for Wilson Strategic Enterprises. But more importantly, it stands for a way of seeing the world as it truly is, interconnected, interdependent, and in need of compound solutions. It began in the combat zones of Iraq, evolved through my work in post-conflict transitions, and matured as I train future military and civilian leaders. It's built on a simple but powerful principle. Defense, diplomacy, development, and commerce must be integrated, not just coordinated, if we're going to survive the age of convergence, because whether the threat is a terrorist cell or a rising sea, the response must be whole of society. Folks, that's the wise way. Now, let's return back to this application to the Central Texas floods, July 2025. Folks, we've been thinking the wise way, we would have seen this flood not as a weather event, but a chain reaction waiting to happen. Here's what that looks like in real terms, through a wise lens. Before the rain fell, we'd have had real and digital scouts mapping vulnerability. Not just flood zones, but nursing homes, trailer parks, low-income neighborhoods. Before the rivers swelled, first responders, police, fire, guard, civic leaders, they would have rehearsed the response together. They would not have met for the first time at the Emergency Ops Center. Before the headlines, trust would have already been built. So when the alert came, people would have known where to go, who to trust, and why they mattered. Folks, that's not big government. That's compound governance. That's resilience rooted in trust. Now, it's important to have a bit of a retrospective because this month is Hurricane Katrina plus 20 years. And 20 years later, as we mark that anniversary, that sad anniversary, we have to ask the same hard questions. Because Katrina wasn't a hurricane. It was a compound failure. Failure of levees, failure of logistics, failure of leadership, failure to value Black lives, poor lives, and old lives. And 2 decades later, let's ask ourselves, have we really done better? Eisenhower didn't have drones, satellite imaging, or smart grids, but he understood readiness. He knew that strategy starts with foresight, not flash. So let me be blunt. If we don't start acting like a country that prepares rather than reacts, we won't just keep losing property. We'll keep losing lives. The wise way calls us to stop dividing defense from development. They are two sides of the same coin. It calls us to stop calling redundancy waste. Redundancy is what makes systems resilient. Stop thinking national security is about bombs and borders. It's about whether your grandma has power when the water rises. And start leading like the future actually depends on it, because it does. If Dwight Eisenhower were here, he'd ask us, why weren't we ready? What did we ignore? And most of all, what will we do differently next time? That, my friends, is real civic leadership. That's the wise way. Well, Susan, thank you for your insight, your stories, and for reminding us that leadership isn't just about having the answers. It's about asking the right questions and having the character to pause, reflect, and choose the harder right over the easier wrong. Fellow travelers, we've talked tonight about alliances and integrity, restraint and responsibility. And at the heart of it all, we've kept returning to one idea: service. Service not as spectacle, but as stewardship. Not as power, but as purpose. Now, as we look ahead to the 250th anniversary of our republic, let's not forget the kind of leadership that helped bring us this far. And let's not kid ourselves either. It's going to take the same clarity, humility, and courage to get us through the next chapter. So to everyone listening, may we lead with quieter hands and steadier hearts. May we hold tight to the civic virtues that endure. And may we, like Ike, keep faith, not just in our country, but in each other. Susan, thank you again. And to all, onward for nation, not self.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.